Welcome to the last lecture in our lecture series for this fall on the history of science. My name is Barbara Lee. I'm the president of the Princeton Adult School, and I want to thank you all for being involved. You can't hear me? Okay.
I think you just need to be closer to the microphone.
I want to thank you for, is that better? Okay, much better. Thank you for coming, and I want to give you a hint of what we have in store for you for next semester. And you are the first to know, except for the board members of the Princeton Adult School. So this is one of the many benefits you get from signing up for this lecture course. You get a preview of upcoming attractions. Next semester, our lecture series is going to be called Politics and Religion, Age-Old Tensions Revisited. Think that might be a little topical? Yeah. We're going to talk about a number of things such as religion and Western political thought. These are not necessarily lecture titles. These are topics. The role of the African American church in contemporary politics. We're going to talk about the U.S., the Arab world, and France, and the line, if there is one, between the religious and the secular. And we're going to talk about whether there's a separation between religion and the state in Islam. Those are just a few of the topics to whet your appetite for next semester. So the brochures will be in the mail around the first of the year, and we hope to see you all back here in February. But let's talk about tonight's lecture. We're very, very pleased to have a distinguished professor of history, Dr. Philip Pauly from Rutgers University, to talk to us tonight about the biological improvement of America. Professor Pauly has been at Rutgers since 1981. He and I were comparing our tenures there. He has a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. His research interests involve the development of the life sciences during the last 2 centuries, and he also studies the roles of scientists in American culture. He's currently examining the history of tensions in the United States between desires for exotic organisms and fears about alien pests. And he and I had a bit of a conversation about that on the ride down from New Brunswick tonight. His book that will be coming out very soon is called Fruits and Plains, The Horticultural Transformation of America. And he's got a number of other publications, honors and awards, and many other wonderful attributes. Plus, he's a fascinating conversationalist. So I think you're going to enjoy Professor Pauly's lecture. So I think what I will do is let him give it to you.
Thank you, Barbara. The first order of business, I guess, is the audio. My No, yes, in the back? No. How's that? Let me see here. Yeah. How's that do? Great. Okay. Great. As the last speaker in this session, in this lecture series, I'm faced with a set of challenges. On the one hand, my interest in my own subject. On the other, the concern to provide some sort of sweep and summation. The concern that the audience has been educated over the course of the semester, that you have certain kinds of knowledge and expectations that I don't know about. And then more locally, as the professor at the state institution, I have to measure up, or would like to be able to measure up to colleagues who have been selected from one of the greatest universities in the world. And so these were my concerns. I looked at the list of other speakers and their topics, and immediately, of course, became more comfortable as I saw that, first of all, that Mike Mahoney had as his talk Clocks to Cloning, and I'm going to talk about cloning, so I very naturally fit into the sequence that was advertised. Secondly, that while the topic was history of science, in fact, it seems to be, from the titles, to have been more about the history of technology. And therefore, this enables me to embrace my institutional identification, to remind you historically that as the College of New Jersey gradually dropped its state responsibilities and name and became Princeton University, Rutgers College took on state and federal dollars, adopted the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, and ultimately became Someone offered me a pointer. Rutgers, the state university of New Jersey, culminating in the construction of a stadium, a football coach with a higher salary than the president, but this all being justified because they stuck it at least temporarily to Don Imus. So this contrast, this context, essentially what I see myself as doing is giving back to the residents of the Garden State. As Rutgers professors have advised about peach orchards, control of mosquitoes, and the Rutgers tomato, I come to the Princeton Adult School, and hence my subject, the biological improvement of America. Now, for most historians, this would have been in scare quotes and would have been about eugenics. And I could talk about eugenics, but I'm not going to do it. I present it without irony. It's going to be primarily about plants, about cloning and controlled breeding, but not on the news media level of the wonders of the modern biotechnological revolution and fears about them and how do we grapple with things, but rather to take a longer view, to offer some deeper reflections, essentially to emphasize how much biotechnology has been embedded in human activity, how much it has changed over the last 250 years, and in particular, how important that has been in the history of the United States. So what's involved here? All right. In the 19th century, the main biotechnologies for plants were assisted movement, anatomical and environmental manipulation, and controlled reproduction. Now, these were not called biotechnology. Rather, they were called culture, as in pear culture or strawberry culture, and I am going to shamelessly exploit that linguistic ambiguity here and hope that it will lead you to rethink the meanings of culture in some significant ways. The meaning of culture in the 19th century was the application of intelligence to the organic, and the highest form of culture was horticulture. And I have lots to say about the history of horticulture. I have a book coming out in a couple of months, as Barbara mentioned. And so the issue for me was how to say something meaningful within the 45 to 50 minutes that I'm allotted. And so what I'm going to do is to offer a brief sketch of the background problem, and then to grab onto three strategically chosen developments and then sketch out with a few hand waves the implications of this. And of course, I'm glad to expand on any and all of these things in the question period. All right, so to start, all right, the problem that English colonists faced when they arrived on the Atlantic, the North American seaboard in the 1600s and the 1700s was first how to survive, and then secondly, how to prosper. And prosper meant to make some money from exports. The problem, first of all, was that the export business was quite fancy and dangerous. The industry was not allowed by the British, and so therefore what was left was agriculture. Within the context of agriculture, then the question was what to grow that could be exportable. Were there plants that were American that could be exported? And this was a great disappointment because either from the Indians or otherwise, the plants that were found were either cheap or vulgar, corn, pumpkins, huckleberries, cranberries, bite one of those, and no new interesting fibers, different from Indian cotton or from linen. The grasses that could support livestock and that kind of export, with the exception of a few, notably Spartina, were too delicate for livestock. And so therefore the immediate issue was to introduce some plants that could be grown in eastern North America to export for a profit. The initial idea, and this was quite sensible if you look at a Mercator projection map, as is up there on the screen, and you look at what the latitude of Philadelphia, New York, and New Jersey is in relation to Europe, was to grow Mediterranean crops, olives, pomegranates, citrus, things of this sort. The problem with the eastern United States is that while the summers are quite like those in Italy, the winters are like those in Sweden. And so the Mediterranean crops did not work. The alternative was English crops, the basic one, of course, being wheat. And wheat grew reasonably well in the Northeast, but had a limited market and had accumulating problems. Wheat was grown in Massachusetts in the early 1600s until what was called blast, now stem rust, arrived and wiped it out. In New Jersey in the 1780s, the problem was the Hessian fly. And on a local note, I can emphasize that the Princeton Faculty Club was the central locus for dealing with locusts, not locust, locus for dealing with the Hessian fly in the 1780s, and I have an entire chapter on that, and so I'm holding myself back from talking about the Hessian fly. Third possibility was tropical annuals, and that worked to some extent. Tobacco was not North American, it was a Brazilian plant. Rice worked reasonably well, but both of these only supported slave societies, which was not what people north of Maryland were particularly interested in. The last possibility, not quite Mediterranean, not English, not tropical, saleable in England, was wine grapes. The place was Vinland. Obviously, it grew grapevines, but the local grapes were unpalatable to Europeans. Let's see what I've got here. Yes, and so the initial projects were to plant European Vitis vinifera. This was done at Jamestown. It was done in North Carolina. It was done in Georgia. It was not successful and generally was attributed to the fact that the colonists were ignorant and didn't have the right culture. There was a big push in the 1760s and the 1770s, first in New Jersey, not in Princeton, but in Piscataway or Highland Park. See, this is precisely where Antill's estate was. This was funded by the British leaders in the 1760s. So this is a very local kind of thing, and more noticeably by Thomas Jefferson. And I put this portrait up because it's not the usual Jefferson you see. It's obviously a more foppish Jefferson, which he was earlier on. Monticello, he understood, was a very geographically unique place. It was in the Virginia Piedmont on a ridge fronting the Blue Ridge. Here's the Blue Ridge. Here's the view from Monticello, which I assume some of you people have seen, looking out towards the east. And in the early, here is this is Monticello. This is the first version. The one sees now is from the 1790s, much more Italian than the later version. And the idea was, in 1773, Jefferson came into contact with an Italian wine merchant and entrepreneur, Filippo Mazzei, and they together concocted a scheme to import Tuscan viticulturi into the Virginia Piemonte and to grow vines. And the idea was that this would be a future of gentlemen's estates, of yeoman peasants, Italian and English wine cellars, and income for people like Jefferson. The problem was for Jefferson, as for Antill, that Vitis vinifera, the Old World grapevine, grew quite well for a couple of years and then would fade. And what was clear was that the North American environment was destructive of high viticulture, was destructive of high culture, that the future in America would not be gentlemen's estates with wine, wheat bread, and as Jefferson also imagined, Arabian horses, but hard scrabble with whiskey, corn pone, and fatback. Here is Jefferson's garden plan from the 1770s in his own handwriting, 561 vines. The commentary that's well known to many people by the French philosophe Guillaume Raynal, that the United States, unable to grow grapes, would be able to suffice for itself in the future, provided that the inhabitants know how to make themselves happy by economy and with mediocrity. All right? Now, the problem was how to deal with this. All right? And the core of my book and the core of what I'm going to be talking about today is to see in the 19th and the 20th century the efforts to resolve this problem. And of course, there are many details and many complications. And as I said, I'm going to choose three organisms: strawberries, come back to grapes, and then grasses. So that first of all, you have some specifics to take away. But the larger points are, first of all, to emphasize that the important changes in plant improvement occurred before genetics, before 1900, that major figures and organizations were involved, not anonymous farmers, that the organisms themselves were important. Improvement or culture was not just a matter of calories in the economy, but of lifestyle, identity, nationality, and destiny. Okay, so strawberries, all right? Strawberries come in many species from around the world. They grow, as you know, from a crown and then send out runners. The main European strawberry was Fragaria vesca, which produced very small fruits, bore for a very short time in June, was grown in aristocrats' gardens, and was essentially modern raspberries, only three or four times more expensive, and for about a month of the year. A great delicacy for aristocrats. In eastern North America, there was Fragaria virginiana, somewhat bigger than Fragaria vesca, but also shy-bearing and only for a very brief time in June. In the 1700s, explorers brought back to Europe Fragaria chiloensis from the Pacific coast, which at least in the samples that were brought back produced large fruits, but that tasted extremely woody. Now, the significant event was in the 1740s and the 1750s when, in a gentleman's botanical garden, the Hortus cliffordiensis in Haarlem in the Netherlands, these plants, because he's a botanist, were all planted next to each other. And as being strawberries, which are extremely sexually promiscuous, they interbred. And the result was a new species. The result of modern culture, not intentional, but the result of the fact that there was a modern culture of botany that put these plants together. The French argued about what this meant for the nature of species and race and varieties. British horticulturalists grabbed onto the new plants and started selling the fruits. These were developed over the next 50 years in Great Britain. Attempts were made to grow them in the United States, which at this time meant Massachusetts, and it didn't work because they froze, because these were British, adapted to the British situation rather than the American. In the American context, the significant events began in the 1830s. A Cambridge nurseryman, and this is just down the road from Harvard, by the name of Charles Mason Hovey, in the first intentional American crossing of different kinds of plants produced over the course of 2 or 3 years, Hovey's seedling, which was the first large, hardy, complexly hybrid kind of a strawberry. And this was great. Hovey sold them for $5 a dozen. You can still buy strawberries now from Burpees for $5 a dozen plants. Okay, so calculate back the inflation, and you can see how expensive these things were. They grew extremely well, and they were advertised in Hovey's new magazine, the Magazine of Horticulture. Notice whose copy this was, the Albany plutocrat Stephen Van Rensselaer, and gets a sense of the audience. The problem with Hovey's seedling was that while it grew very well in his nursery with a whole bunch of other strawberry varieties, when he sold the clones and people tried to scale up to commercial production, Hovey's seedling was not fecund. The focus of discussion about this was in Cincinnati, Ohio, my hometown. It centered around Nicholas Longworth, born in Newark and emigrated to Cincinnati. This is the grandfather of the Longworth who married Alice Roosevelt, okay, and the Rookwood pottery and all of that sort of stuff. That came later. And what Longworth claimed in the early 1840s was that Hovey's seedling was deficient in the male organs. Hovey responded that Cincinnati's strawberry culture was too low to produce these highly cultured berries. And the arguments went back and forth. The problem was that all kinds of sexual variations are possible in strawberries. Some clones are female, some clones are male, some are hermaphroditic. How the expression is worked out can depend upon the nutrition level, i.e. the culture. Okay, so there was a great deal of controversy in what was called the Great Strawberry War of the 1840s. The biology was gradually worked out over the course of the 1840s by Cincinnati horticulturalists primarily, and the resolution of it. So the biology was worked out, but the resolution of the problem was that high strawberry culture was too difficult because high culture in strawberries meant maintaining a small number of male plants and a large number of female plants and picking out the extra females and maintaining the males which didn't bear, whereas every grower, you pull out the ones that don't bear and you keep the ones that do bear, and that would cause essentially a single-sex field, and so the reproduction system would collapse. The solution to this was to introduce, and all of you, I suspect, grow these, introduce hermaphrodite strawberry varieties, which are foolproof, so that even New Jersey backyard gardeners and New York backyard gardeners can grow them if you can deal with the aphids, and can grow them, and that these were not necessarily as highly flavored as the separate sex ones, but they were good enough. And in fact, in the United States, the availability of cheap strawberries for 3 months during the summer became one of the international advertising points for the bounty of the American democracy, as opposed to Germany, France, and England, where strawberries were the possession of effete, upper-class, garden-owning aristocrats. Okay, I've dropped my microphone here. Okay, so second stage here. Second example, grapes. In the national period, in the early 1800s, there is a rejection of European grape culture. The idea is to turn to the Native American grape, Vitis labrusca, also called the fox grape, sometimes attacked for smelling like a fox, fox's anal glands. Totally unpalatable, but the idea was to take this wild American plant and to tame it, to culture it, to improve it so that it could live at the table, at a gentleman and a gentlewoman's table as a table grape and as a wine grape. A number of examples of this. In the early 1800s, a grape called either the Alexander or the Schuylkill Muscadel was discovered in Philadelphia. It was also called the Cape grape because alternatively it could be marketed as South African, was developed. But the really important one was in the 1830s, the discovery of the Catawba by a amateur grower in Washington, D.C., in Georgetown, who had gotten it from Western Maryland, and it had come from North Carolina, and that's where the Catawba name came from. This was picked up by the Cincinnati real estate speculator and merchant Nicholas Longworth. Longworth promoted the Catawba as a great American grape, as the source of a new kind of American wine, got Longfellow to promote it, and I'm not going to recite the poem. You can read it there for a minute. And Longworth, if anyone has been to Cincinnati, realized the Jeffersonian ideal, because what he had done was that he bought what is now called Mount Adams, which is the hill just to the east of downtown Cincinnati, absolutely useless 45-degree hillside, and he turned it into grapevines, with peasants, not Italian but German, because that was who was coming to Cincinnati, German peasants. His house, the Garden of Eden, was on the top of the hill, and so it was what Jefferson imagined. And the Catawba wine industry flourished in Cincinnati from the 1830s to the 1860s. Rookwood Pottery used the old wine cellars as their for their kiln work 50 years later. So this was great. The problem was that the Catawba was very different tasting from European wines. And secondly, it couldn't be grown in Massachusetts, which was what really mattered. And so people in Massachusetts wanted to create a high-quality Native American variety. And this was done at the center of American culture, Concord, Massachusetts, not Longfellow, but Emerson. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot. Heard round the world the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the beginning of the United States of America as an independent country. The individual involved was Ephraim Bull. Bull was a upper-class craftsman, a gold beater, married a daughter of the president of Harvard. So this is not somebody who's of no social consequence in Boston in the 1820s and the 1830s. Moved to Concord essentially to become a sort of gentleman suburbanite in the 1830s, but Concord and was connected by the railroad to Boston. Built a cottage. Here it is in 1910. But Concord was not just any suburb in the 1830s and the 1840s. Bull's next-door neighbor was, they weren't permanent residents, first the Alcotts, then Nathaniel Hawthorne, then Harriet Lothrop. If anybody read the Five Little Peppers book as a young girl, this was the house redecorated into late 19th century style. Ralph Waldo Emerson lived a half mile down the road. Here's the geography. Thoreau's cabin was just a little ways away. Bull and Thoreau knew each other. Bull and Alcott knew each other. Bull and Hawthorne knew each other. Bull was a spiritualist of different sorts. So this is the center of Alcott had come to Concord from a utopian settlement called Fruitlands, which was vegetarian and possibly involved homosexual free love, and so that was where his wife told him he had to leave. And so this was the environment in which Bull was operating. Bull grew a large number of different fruits and was interested in improving wild natives. He was a theory-driven horticulturist, started out with a grape seedling that had been brought from the river by stray birds. He harvested this in the mid-1840s, crossed it with the Catawba, planted the seeds, and then selected for the weaker offspring. Not the ones that came up the first year, but the ones that came up the second year, because the first ones were sort of too aggressive and vegetative. The ones he was interested in were the ones that would put their energies into the higher tasks of producing grapes. Of better quality. He ultimately produced what he called, for obvious reasons, the Concord grape as America's native grape. This was launched by Charles Mason Hovey, his nursery and the Magazine of Horticulture in 1854, presented as flavorful, as having good shoulders, and being vigorous in comparison to, as one commentator noted, its two tender Syrian brethren, which on the one hand refers to the geographic origin of Vitis vinifera, on the other hand was a sort of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish kind of a sentiment. I make the connection to anti-Semitism because Bull immediately went from his success as a horticulturist to a political career with the American Party, which is more generally known in the textbooks as the Know-Nothing Party in the 1850s, deeply opposed to immigration, in particular Irish immigration and Jewish immigration into Boston, where capitalists were taking over from good little old-fashioned artisan gold beaters like Ephraim Bull, etc. And on that basis, Bull was in the state legislature, was appointed to the State Board of Agriculture in the 1860s, and became a significant figure in Concord and Massachusetts for at least some decades. The Concord was picked up after the Civil War, not in Massachusetts, but in New Jersey, by the Methodist teetotaling dentist, Thomas Welsh, who figured out how to pasteurize grape juice. And at the turn of the century, when the Concord grape growing industry boomed in upstate New York, and as national markets for packaged foods developed, the Concord was, in the form of Welch's grape juice, was marketed as the national drink, in contrast to the degenerate European taste for wine presented by William Jennings Bryan at the first diplomatic reception when he was Secretary of State in 1913, to the disgust of the British and the French and the Germans and things of this sort. But from Bryan's perspective, pure, wholesome Americanness. And now that would be interesting as the end of the story, but of course it isn't the end of the story, because at the same time as Welch's was being presented as a sort of uber-wasp, pure American national drink, Jewish immigrants into New York, conservative Jewish immigrants into New York, were looking for the cheapest, most available grapes to turn into kosher wine, and they chose Concords, adding large amounts of sugar to cut the what was called the leathery taste of the Concord grape juice, but it's still leathery in the wine form, this would have made Bull turn in his grave. However, it's fitting, because in fact the Concord was not a native American grape. It was a second or third generation hybrid between Old World Vitis vinifera and New World Labruscas, and that hybridization, international hybridization, was the basis for its success. The vinifera heritage made it palatable to European Americans, at least barely. The Labrusca heritage was more important because what it did was that it enabled the vines to resist Native American fungi. Black rot, first of all, powdery mildew, downy mildew that had co-evolved with the American grapevines over millions of years, and that when the weak Vitis vinifera vines were brought here, decimated them completely. Okay, but that the hybridization enabled Catawbas and Concords to grow for a while. The Catawba industry in Cincinnati collapsed in the early 1860s because the American fungi evolutionarily caught up with this temporary advantage that the grapes had figured out. And the Concord industry was on the ropes in the 1870s and the 1880s until botanists figured out how to push back the fungi with chemical fungicides, in particular Bordeaux mixture, essentially a copper sulfate solution, and so the survival of the grape industry and the development of both Welch's grape juice and Shapiro's and Manischewitz was the consequence of this great, unknown at the time, hybridization event. All right. Now, let me go to the third of my examples. All right. Grasses. And what this does is to introduce the broader evolutionary and environmental perspective and implications. All right. Now, many grasses are ordinary wild plants. A few are totally domesticated, like corn and wheat, which cannot survive without human help. But the interesting ones are the ones in between, the commensals that evolved in fields and pastures over the course of the last 12,000 years under grazing pressure from the livestock that humans in the Middle East and then in Europe had domesticated. The kinds of grasses that could survive this sort of trampling and browsing rapidly spread, evolved with the livestock over the course of 12,000 years throughout the Eurasian continent. The eastern seaboard of the United States, I'm talking about the eastern seaboard and not west of the Mississippi. The eastern seaboard of the United States, the grasses had not ever, since the Pleistocene, had to deal with that kind of grazing pressure. And so when settlers came and brought their horses and their cattle and their hogs and their sheep, the American grasses, again, with the exception of Spartina and a few marsh grasses, this is the Great Swamp near Morristown, and you can see how agricultural it was in the middle of the 19th century. This was not a wilderness, this was a farm, a public farm. That apart from the beach, apart from the salt and freshwater marsh grasses, American grasses were essentially useless because they could not hold up under grazing pressure and did not grow for very long periods of time. The response to this was both spontaneously and intentionally the introduction of what were called English grasses. Okay, red top, timothy. These spread very rapidly, hybridized with closely related North American species, hybridized with each other, rapidly evolved, and the paradigm of the English grass that becomes American such that nobody knows where it came from by the 1800s is Kentucky bluegrass, which is a European grass, but don't say that to the people in Kentucky. A good grass was critical, and again, I'm using this word very self-consciously, critical to a high level of culture. Okay? Agricultural improvement in the Northeast depended upon mixed agriculture where you had large numbers of livestock producing manure, producing nitrogen, which produced crops, which fed the livestock, which increased the amount of manure, which raised the economic level of the farmers. And that the issue was what was a good grass. A good grass was one that was palatable, so that the cattle would eat, but it was also durable. It would spread on its own. It would endure drought. Okay. The problem was, as I've indicated, that English grasses, while they might work reasonably well in New York and in Massachusetts and in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and perhaps in Ohio and to some extent in Kentucky, once you went further south and further west, they were not very good. They didn't work in terms of the seasons and the climates in much of North America. So the issue was to find more grasses, more new and good, more good grasses. And this was very, very difficult, all right? Because how do you know if you're going to Europe or Australia or Russia or anywhere that grasses that you might find there will grow in North America, will have good agronomic properties? How do you know that this grass is not that grass? How can you distinguish them? Taxonomy was extremely important in dealing with grasses in a way that it was not for orchids or roses or things of that sort. One of the standard lines of the mid-19th century is, what is the grass? Beats me. Okay, as Walt Whitman, well, here's who knew what the grass was. George Vesey was the chief botanist at the USDA during the Gilded Age, and he instituted a major program to introduce and to move grasses around the world and around North America. This was, and I want to emphasize, you'll see the emphasis through repetition, this was a public agency operating on public lands for the public good, dealing with public plants in the sense that they were not cultured or garden plants or private. They went on their own once they were introduced. Many of these spread widely, and you can either find them on rangeland out in the west, or next summer do a little collecting from your lawns, and you will find many of these different kinds of grasses. I actually did that last summer, and it's quite educational. Let's see now. So, but some, all right, introduced either by the USDA or by other people, generated controversies. Let me look at my watch here. Yeah, I'm just about right on time. Okay. Generated controversies. The first and most notable of these was Johnson grass. Johnson grass was introduced by a South Carolina planter by the name of Means, George Means, who was a son of who went to Yale and moved back to South Carolina, was a governor prior to the Civil War, and was a rebellious traitor during the Civil War. He did a tour of the Near East in the 1830s, saw this grass growing in Egypt and in Turkey, and brought it back, spread it widely among his friends in South Carolina and out to Alabama, when somebody named Johnson grabbed onto it and promoted it under his name. And so it was known as Johnson grass. Johnson grass was wonderful because it would grow extremely rapidly in southern conditions. It produced rhizomes so that if it were grazed down, it would immediately come back up. You could get four crops per year. It also spread through seeds, so it just went all over the place. And this was great because one of the continuing arguments about the inferiority of the South was that it was relying purely on a cotton monoculture. And so long as the South was bound to cotton culture, it would never really be prosperous. The problem wasn't slaves. The problem wasn't that they didn't work. It wasn't that they weren't intelligent. As one commentator noted, they're not as smart as the English, but they're certainly as smart as Belgians. The problem was that southern planters didn't have enough grass, and the consequence was they had to buy artificial fertilizer, and they were therefore continually in debt and just growing cotton. And so there were these sort of reformers prior to the Civil War. After the Civil War, Yankee USDA agents advocated Johnson grass extremely widely because they wanted to kill King Cotton and transform the South into a mixed agricultural economy where you would not have rich planters and sharecroppers, but something that looked like the North, relatively independent yeomen. And they promoted Johnson grass. And the great thing about Johnson grass was that once you planted it on one farm, it would move to the other farms. And because it had rhizomes, it was impossible to get rid of. And so it spread on its own. Texas bourbon cotton growers in the 1890s put the screws to the USDA to reclassify Johnson grass as an execrable weed, okay, because Johnson grass attacked cotton, okay, and so these literally were possibly violent controversies in terms of, because once a certain number of people started to grow Johnson grass and did mixed agriculture, then the infrastructure for mixed agriculture develops, the infrastructure for cotton culture and the peonage of the blacks declines, and so it does transform. It has the potential of transforming Southern culture and society. Okay, in the 20th century, in the West, and these are continuing arguments among the invasive species ecologists, various brome grasses, which were planted after the decimation of western rangeland by sheep grazers, and that have now taken over. My last example, because it's perhaps it's bringing it up to the present and is closer to home, although it's not a grass, okay, it's a legume, but the same issues apply, is kudzu, which I assume many people have heard of. I lived for 2 years in Athens, Georgia, and so I experienced it quite directly. Kudzu is a Japanese relative of the bean, and it was introduced into the United States, quite specifically, in 1876 because the Japanese had an exhibit at the World's Fair in Philadelphia, and they wanted something that would grow Japanese very quickly, and they, being smart people, picked kudzu because by July it was all over the pavilion. It was picked up as an ornamental. It was pushed in the early 1900s in Florida as a forage crop, and so here we have cattle browsing contentedly in a field of kudzu. The more important thing is in the 1930s, when there was an erosion emergency, the USDA planted kudzu widely all over the Southeast in gullies and places like that, and I can explain the agronomy of that if you're interested, for erosion control. But after 1950, and particularly 1960, it became the vine that ate the South. And here's another instance of it. And was damned by Southerners. But if you compare the arguments of the 1970s to the arguments of the 1930s, in the 1930s, the idea was that, well, of course, kudzu can be controlled because there are free-ranging hogs all over the South, and they will eat up the kudzu buds and the kudzu vines, and if that doesn't work, you can use chain gangs. So the decline of free-ranging hogs and chain gangs, which is an indication of a higher level of culture, was what led to the expansion of kudzu. The continued expansion of kudzu is that otherwise Southern culture is still relatively at a low level, and they don't hire well-paid maintenance workers to deal with these problems. And so this, of course, feeds into the contemporary arguments about invasive species. Now, there's another lecture that I could give about the transition from what I've described as culture to biological engineering grounded in discrete genetic manipulations, emphasizing corn, wheat, soybeans, and et cetera. But that's another lecture, and not one that I'm ready to give. In any case, my point here, okay, what I've tried to get across here is a historical point, all right? Primarily that the big changes in the United States involving what I'm calling biological improvement happened earlier, happened before 1900, happened certainly before genetic engineering and before genetics, okay? I've tried to give you some snippets of what those changes were, how they involved intelligence, labor, interests, and the evolution of the organisms themselves, that during the last 2 centuries, these people, these horticulturists, created a large part of what is, we don't want to call it the natural world, but the world we have all emerged from, and unless specifically educated otherwise, see as normal and natural and suburban, the things that we enjoy. And I could imagine to see this more broadly within the context of the other talks. How do I want to say this? That to imagine this more broadly in relation to the other talks, but to say it more strongly than perhaps my preceding colleagues have done, and more boldly and more baldly, because this is now the last word, to say that the history of science and technology has been the history of culture. So I will stop there. Okay. Oh, yes. I just need to get some more water here. Should I handle them myself? Okay. I'm glad to get questions. If not, we can all go home, but I hope, yeah.
Wine areas
Yes.
Timberlake region, New York, and some of the other areas. Were they directly related to the evolution that you were referring to about the same time as the concrete great development?
The realization that upstate New York was an extremely good place for growing not just grapes, but apples, pears, and a whole range of temperate zone fruits. That industry develops in the 1850s, and it's partly because of transportation and access to New York. It's partly because the climate up there, and I don't know the precise details of it, the climate is such that you don't get the dramatic kinds of spring fluctuations of temperatures, so that the plants leaf out in a more predictable fashion. Jefferson's problem was that apricots and so on would leaf out, and then in early May you'd get a big freeze coming off the Blue Ridge, and these things would die. That the moderating effects of the lakes and the particular geography up there was such that production could be more reliable. By the 1850s, New York is the fruit center of the United States, and that continues until California takes over. Does that answer your question? Or yeah, okay. Yeah. You can cut it back. I mean, you can cut it back. It doesn't flower. It does not reproduce. Normally it does not reproduce through seed, so it's a lot easier to deal with than Johnson grass. It has to be dug. It has to be dug up, or I suppose herbicides would work, so that if you have a field that is filled with kudzu, you can get rid of the kudzu. I didn't show the slide, but there are fields in Brooklyn of kudzu right around. I live in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, and I was walking up the street, and there are fields of kudzu there. Well, you want to build a building, you can get rid of the kudzu, right? And so the same thing can be done in the South. It's a matter of money and manpower, and the idea that it can be eliminated permanently everywhere. The answer, of course, is no. Where does it grow primarily? It grows primarily in disturbed, marginal places, along roadsides, right? Along roadsides, in abandoned yards, next to dumpsters and parking lots, so that it's predictable that it will be there. If you didn't have kudzu, you would have something else, right? Perhaps not quite as lush, but the idea that it would all be what is it called? The yellow rose of Texas. That's American Beauty roses is fantasy. Yeah.
How does all this relate to the great wine disasters in Europe at the turn of the century?
Right. The American pest that I did not talk about was phylloxera. Phylloxera is an aphid, not a normal aphid, but a root-sucking aphid, so not visible. And the problem there was that Americans are importing European grapevines. Europeans are also importing American grapevines. And as they imported American grapevines, they imported phylloxera. And this caused major disruption to the European wine industry in both France and Germany in the 1860s and the 1870s. A great deal of anti-American prejudice, because at the same time as the phylloxera arrived, the Colorado potato beetle crossed the Atlantic and decimated potato production. So that there was a great deal of the idea that invasive species is just here is not correct. The Europeans were just as concerned about these vicious American insects as vice versa. The solution was to graft Vitis vinifera stock onto phylloxera-resistant American roots, and that then enabled the rebirth of the European wine industry in the 1870s and the 1880s. and that was aided by the first American USDA entomologist, a wonderfully dashing figure by the name of Charles Valentine Riley. And he was presented and was perceived as the savior of the European wine industry after the Americans had wiped it out. Okay. Yes?
Do you believe there's a great future in biofuels?
That's sort of beyond my job description, but I'm glad to offer opinions, okay? This is more as a citizen than anything else, but as a historian, I would say don't put your money on it, because these things are always enmeshed in hype and subsidies and promotion. And I, at least not having investigated this in great detail, I have not yet seen the working out of how all the various subsidies for, in particular we're talking about corn, right, how that in fact is going to lead to a net both economic and ecological benefit. Wood chip and sugarcane debris in Brazil seems to be more. The sugarcane seems to be the most likely, because it's already producing sugar, which is easily gasified. The wood chips is a bigger technology to work out, but the historical precedents are that the promoters do not pay attention to the fact that ethanol from corn ought to require the calculating in of all the petroleum costs of the fertilizer plants, of the barges, the costs of the effluents, et cetera, and I am highly, and given the people who promote this, I am highly dubious about that I would not buy a used car from them. So, yeah.
When does corn become important?
A feed? Oh, it's an important feed from the very beginning, as a feed for animals, and that's from the get-go. As a food for humans, okay, it's always marginal. The extent to which American identity is bound up with corn goes up and down depending upon what the uses of the plant are, depending upon the export market. This is literally my current project, is to try to reinterpret the Green Revolution within the context of the cultures of wheat and corn over the prior century and a half. So I'm learning about precisely this subject quite rapidly. The significant thing about corn is that corn is so malleable, right? And again, before genetics, the corn growers in the early 19th century understood that the Indians had transformed whatever corn originally was into so many different forms, and that it could be made into so many more different forms. And that's what they do all through the 19th century, because corn, like strawberries, will have sex with anything. In contrast to wheat, which only had sex with itself. Okay, and so wheat was the Puritan. Wheat was Puritan, and wheat was high-class human food. And so the burden of what I'm working on right now is to understand the comparative histories of corn and wheat in agricultural development, not agricultural development, but in sort of the poetics of breeding in the 20th century. So it's a great question, but gives me the opportunity, yeah. Only that honeybees, of course, are introduced species. They are not American. And as you can, I assume you can see the subtext of my talk has involved some slight degree of polemic against the more extreme invasive species opponents. Okay, and one of the arguments here is to grasp the ecological situation as a whole and to understand all the different species that have been translocated themselves from the old world to the new since Columbus. Honeybees being a very significant instance of that. So that thinking about honeybees are domesticated animals as much as cattle. Honeybees are non-native, just like cattle. Honeybees have prospered in North America because they left pathogens behind. Honeybees can rise and crash because new pathogens that had been floating around in Eurasia can appear. And so it's not surprising that you've got these sorts of dramatic population changes, and they need to be managed. Okay, and again, then you get involved in the issue of the fact that honeybee producers are subsidized and they have a lobby and they push the USDA, et cetera, you know, and then you get, this is really politically incorrect, you get people like Sue Hubble writing an entire book about honeybees without ever talking about price supports. And, you know, it's just, oh, the bees and me, isn't this wonderful? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Chile and,
Right.
and Australia and South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Such an internationalization. Is there a common thread historically from of all of these different countries? Are they all starting off with similar types of grapes?
Sure, they're all, well, I don't say all, okay? Let me see if I can come at it in a way. The first thing is that grape culture is totally transformed in the 1890s and insecticides, okay? Because it enables conifer to be grown essentially anywhere with the proper resources, all right? So that's the first point. The second point, which is in a certain sense more interesting, is that the history of wine grapes is like the history of violins, in the sense that whereas one usually thinks of technologies as expanding and diversifying and expanding and diversifying and improving and changing, right? So that you get all sorts of different kinds of widgets and laptops and things like that. The history of wine, like the history of violins, has been the successful effort on the part of a group of aficionados to say, now, this is the moment. This is the ideal. And that what Stradivarius created, this is what we aspire to from that point, from 16 whatever onward. What the French vintners created in the late 1700s and the early 1800s is what we aspire to now, always. And of course, one gets a certain number of California vintners and things. I'm not a big wine aficionado, but I know that there are a certain number of California vintners who try to push different kinds of tastes, but you know, they are struggling against the huge weight of gustatory and cultural imperialism described by Pierre Bourdieu, good name, Bourdieu, not Bordeaux, but still, that where a certain kind of taste becomes hegemonic. And so whether you're Chilean or Australian or New Zealand or whatever, the idea is to make a French wine only better, right? Whereas there are thousands of different varieties of grapes with different tastes that would produce different kinds of wines, you know, and those are novelties. So there's an interesting thing there, yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. No, no. There are a couple of books on this, so it's not something I pay a huge amount of attention to, but it's essentially Anglophilic. You know, the lawns, right? Green lawns all year round. The only, well, not the only place, but the place in which they grew well in the 19th century was in Devon, Devon, Cornwall, various parts of southern England with mild climates, rain all year round, and sheep cropping and manuring the ground. And you had great lawns on all the great estates. And so insofar as Americans, from Andrew Jackson Downing in the 1830s and 40s, are trying to emulate the ideal of the English country house and estate, the 12-month out of the year, or at least from April to November, green lawn becomes part of that. Okay, in spite of the fact that commentators would repeatedly say, you know, it doesn't work that way. It's going to turn. And my father, who I grew up in, you know, suburban Cincinnati with an acre and a half. His neighbors were all cutting the grass madly and watering. And he said, let it grow, and and let it get brown. It'll come back in the fall. So he was laissez-faire about it, and I certainly share that perspective. But I live in Brooklyn, so I don't have a lawn. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Varieties? Yes. Sure. This is a very interesting phenomenon. First of all, I've studied this primarily in roses. Okay. And I actually had, oh, that's right. I did not show the last two slides. There's my strawberries, but this is what I wanted to show. Heirloom, first for peculiar reasons. You can buy it. I have it in my backyard. Okay. The story is, okay, and again, these involve the large point here is the relationship between desire, perception, and biological reality. Okay. In the early 19th century, this was modern technology. And I repeatedly made this claim, and no one has denied it, but it's hard to say it's correct, is that if you think about what is the hallmark of modern marketing and modern consumption, it's the annual model change. The idea that there is a reliable expectation that the new and the better will be available every year, okay, or on some very regular basis. And as far as I know, the first place where that occurs is with roses in the 1830s and the 1840s, where the French nurserymen are advertising, you know, on a regular basis, this is the new rose, because they've got a whole backlog of hundreds of thousands of hybridizations that they've been doing, and they're continually perfecting, and they don't want to flood the market, so you don't put them out too quickly. So it's a regular supply to feed the desire for novelty and the better. Same thing with heirloom tomatoes, beans, etc. These were the high-tech products of the 19th century. Okay? Now what happens is that less so with roses and more so with vegetables, right? Because roses are hobbyists and vegetables less so, is that the commercial varieties of apples and beans and squashes and things like that become increasingly predominant. And that, you know, you've got to, by the early 20th century, you've got to go to the mail order catalogs in order to be able to find some variety that you may have known about 20 years before. These were continually maintained by a combination of state agricultural people and aficionados and geneticists and so on up into the 1970s. There was a great deal of concern that they were disappearing because they weren't being paid attention to. And so in the 1970s and 80s, there was a relatively large, dare we call it, grassroots movement to try to pull these various varieties together and to propagate them and to trade them back and forth, something called the Seed Savers Network. And this is quite interesting because it's in conjunction at very big international kinds of concerns revolving around the disappearance of what were called land races, primitive land races of wheat and corn and things like that, where the introduction of modern agriculture and the Green Revolution was going to lead to the disappearance of the old sort of homey little varieties of wheat and corn that were being planted by peasants in hills of Mexico and Kazakhstan and Afghanistan and places like that. So there is, it's from the 80s, this new interest, partly because of this fear of genetic collapse, and partly because it was the 60s and the 70s, and back to the land and, you know, sort of sentimentalism and romanticism. They come together, and to my mind, the thing that comes out of it, I mean, because it's what comes to me, is starting to pay attention to what really was this history, okay? Going beyond, ooh, heirloom tomatoes, right? And that the next step is to say, well, heirloom tomatoes are nice, and this is really nice, right? But I'm growing it not because it's some sort of primitive rose, but because it's the first modern rose. Okay, that seems to me to be the next step.
I think we need to get Professor Pauly back to Brooklyn. But we hope he'll come back sometime. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions. They're fun to answer.